32 people on. We'll wait another minute or so to get some more to join. Thank you all for joining us today at this webinar. I would like to say a big thank you to Joe Ikley and Madeleine Smith to agree to come together to discuss new Dicamba rules and the future of pesticide labeling. This presentation will be recorded. At the end, you will have time to ask questions, either probably sending it through the chat box, or if Scott is around, he'd probably allow you to speak. We won't be recording that. Um, Other than that, Joe and Madeline will be taking care of the presentation. We have Scott. If we have any issues, we'll take care of that. And Misty will also be online. Yeah, the numbers are still increasing. We have 39 now. So who will go first? Joe, you will go first, I suppose.
Yep, I'm going first.
Yeah, I'll say give them 1 more minute, and you'll probably have a few more on as well. So thank you all very much for participating, and thanks to Joe and Madeline for putting this together. And please, everybody, mute your speakers. If not, Scott or Misty can kind of take care of that as well. Thank you.
All right, well, since this is being recorded, I think we will go ahead and get started to make sure we get through all the information we want to get through in a timely fashion. So as Mohammed mentioned, I'm Joe Ikley, the Extension Weed Specialist. Co-host today will be Madeleine Smith, our Extension Pesticide Specialist. So maybe just a few notes before we kick off the recording. Yes, we are going to entertain questions at the end. So there's a chat box and a Q&A box. The Q&A part will not be recorded, though. This whole presentation will be recorded, so will be available later for folks to take a look at, for folks that can't be on today, or if they want to revisit any points. So I'm going to start kind of with some of the recent history on dicamba use in soybean, and then Madeleine will fill in kind of the 30,000-foot view of what's kind of going on at the EPA and why some of these changes are coming down the pike. But first, I'm going to state this several times throughout the course of today. This is an informational presentation. It does not count as a replacement for the mandatory dicamba training. So for folks who wish to use the three products, Striax from Bayer, Ingenia from BASF, or Tavium from Syngenta, you do have to take mandatory training for mixers, loaders, and applicators. And so those are available on the company website. So this does not replace any mandatory training. This is just an informational webinar. The other thing I will mention, things can move pretty quickly within the dicamba world. So information presented today is accurate as of April 15th. So if you are watching this later, things may change between now and whenever you are watching. So just again, some of the starting notes. I mentioned the three herbicides and the manufacturers. So their websites are there on the screen. So each one's pretty easy to kind of do a Google search and find, but Bayer is striaxapplicationrequirements.com. BASF is ingeniaherbicide.com/stewardship. And then Tavium is syngenta.us.com/herbicides/Tavium application stewardship. So each of these companies has a litany of information to support these products, including their mandatory training modules, approved VRAs and other things, and we'll kind of talk about those throughout the course of this presentation. So just kind of a little bit of history or background. So we first received the dicamba registrations for over-the-top use and Extend, and then now Extend Flex soybean in 2017. So this is basically, we're a decade into using these products within soybean, and we have seen several iterations of labels over the last 10 years. So in 2017, across many of the soybean growing areas of the U.S., we had a lot of off-target movement of dicamba, and that basically triggered a new label in 2018 to address some of the issues that we had saw in the 2017 season. Then 2022 in June, we had our first court vacature of labels. So we all kind of learned in real time how much of a wrench that can throw into the spray season. We got labels back, And then February of 2024, we had another court vacature of labels. So this latest label was issued on February 6th of this year. So this is the fourth or fifth iteration of these labels we've had over the last 10 years. And each time things have been a little bit different. So this time we do have some additional things that we will cover today because this is the first time this label has been passed under the Herbicide Strategy of the Endangered Species Act. I will note that these labels are set to expire in February of 2028, so it's a 2-year label. I have an asterisk there because things can move quickly. So before the calendar even got into March, these new products were back in the court system. So the registration of these products are already being challenged within the court system. And it just kind of depends on how quickly things can move within the court system if things happen between now and February 2028. So as always, things are subject to change when products are being or under litigation. So these are, again, just to highlight, these are the 3 products for use in over-the-top dicamba or over-the-top use in soybean. There are still all the other dicamba formulations on the market that we've had for several decades. So those still hold their pre-plant usage. We can use them pre-harvest in soybean to control weeds and fall and spring burn down applications. So those products are still kind of registered as they always have been. We often might talk about using a pre-plant application of dicamba prior to planting soybean. Most of the label language you see might say we get an inch of rainfall and then wait 14 or 30 days. That's typically for states east and south of us. If you are less than 25 inches of rainfall a year, which is most of North Dakota, then we do have more restrictive pre-plant restrictions. But just wanted to highlight again, those older labels are not affected by anything we're talking about today. These are focusing on these 3 products. So, use pattern. This has been a pretty similar use pattern for basically since the first iteration of the label, where the use rate is a half pound of dicamba acid equivalent. So depending on which product you use, product rates, Ingenia, that's 12.8 fluid ounces per acre. Striax is 22 fluid ounces per acre. And then Tavium is a higher use rate, 3.53 pints, but this gives you 1 pound of S-metolachlor in addition to that half pound of dicamba. So that is a premixture product. So the other thing is that in past iterations of the label, we have been able to use up to 2 pounds of dicamba throughout the course of a growing season. This go around, it is capped as 1 pound of dicamba that we can use throughout the growing season. So what this basically means is if we decide to use Ingenia, Striax, or Tavium, we can use those 2 times per year at that half pound rate to get up to 1 pound per acre. However, what is kind of new this time is, and we did ask EPA for clarification on this, is that if you do use the 2 applications to get up to 1 pound, that would then prohibit using other dicamba formulations in a spring pre-plant, a pre-harvest situation, or even in the fall. So they have put a 1 pound restriction of dicamba use on the calendar year if these products are utilized within crop. So that's kind of a new one, but wanted to highlight that part of the labels. So timing. This has changed kind of slightly throughout the years. So Ingenia and Striax, if we use these in soybean, these are the straight dicamba products. We can use them pre-plant up through R1. And the language straight from the label is do not apply after R1 or crop response may occur. Tavium is pre-plant through V4 or 4-trifoliate soybean. This is primarily because of that addition of S-metolachlor, and that kind of reflects the label language on most of those S-metolachlor containing products that we don't apply them past the 4th trifoliate in soybean. What is new for North Dakota this year, and again, accurate at least as of April 15th, is we do not have a calendar date cutoff. So in previous years, we have had a June 30th cutoff date for using these products in soybean. North Dakota this year, we are going with the federal label, so it is based on your soybean growth stage. If you do have farmland in Minnesota or South Dakota, those states do have additional restrictions, so please be advised of that if you are making applications in multiple states. So some additional restrictions, or additional points to consider, I should say. In the past, we had specific nozzles that were approved for use on these products. That specific nozzle restriction has now gone away. So there is no master list of approved nozzles. The new label language just says your droplet size must be coarse or coarser according to, and that's a code from the engineering societies on droplet sizes. And so if you have your typical nozzle catalog, for instance, a TJET catalog, and you want to use a certain nozzle and it says at this pressure and this rate, that delivers a coarse droplet or larger, then that means that you can use that nozzle at those approved pressures. So that is kind of new. It's more open compared to previous iterations of the label. We also used to have very strict, or I should say very specific recommendations on tank mixes, or restrictions on tank mixes. So you would go to the websites and say what you might want to apply and see if that is approved or not. There is no tank mix websites this go around. So many of our products are able to be tank mixed with dicamba. There are a couple caveats here. So for every application, we always have to have two different adjuvants in there. A drift reduction adjuvant, which is an oil emulsion based adjuvant at a rate of 0.3% volume to volume. So this is kind of specific to this go around. Previous iterations, we would be able to use a polyacrylamide or a guar-based DRA. This time, or at least at this point in time, it is an oil emulsion. So if you're not sure what your favorite DRA is, make sure you talk with your adjuvant person to make sure you're using an improved oil emulsion for this use. We also have to use an approved volatility reducing agent, or VRA. The last go around the labels, we had to have 20 fluid ounces per acre of a vapor grip extra type of adjuvant. This go around, it is 40 fluid ounces. So there are several approved product names on the marketplace, and the company websites from Bayer, BASF, and Syngenta do have the list of approved adjuvants, VRAs on the website, and that does change almost daily. So I always encourage you to make sure you check the site to make sure you have the right product in place. The only prohibition this go around is we cannot mix ammonium sulfate with these dicamba products. So we can use AMS replacement water conditioners if we need to condition the water, but we cannot add AMS. To the point, so this question has come up a couple of times, can we mix glufosinate or the Liberty type of herbicide with dicamba? That is allowable, but we cannot use AMS. So we don't have many data points on what that might look like from a weed control standpoint, since we know we need AMS to make something like glufosinate look better. But so we can tank mix those herbicides, but again, there is a strict prohibition. If you have these three dicamba products in the tank, you cannot have ammonium sulfate in that same tank. And so this will be the last slide for me before we get to listen to someone else talk for a while here. But the other changes that we want to spend most of today talking about are these 3 points. So you'll notice if you read through these labels, section 9, 10, and 11 on the label have mitigations on there for spray drift, runoff, and volatility. And this is largely due to new language on labels to address the herbicide strategy from the EPA. So now we're going to have Madeleine kind of give the bigger overview, and then her and I will go back and forth on parts of what the herbicide strategy discusses and how this applies to these new dicamba labels.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So as Joe said at the beginning, I'm going to take a step back here and look at the kind of broader context here of these ESA mitigations. And so hopefully by the time we get through this, you'll have a better understanding of what this is going to look like moving forward, not just for these dicamba labels, but into the future as well. So I wanted to just spend a minute or two talking about where this has come from. And we have the Endangered Species Act here in the US. It's not new. It's been around since 1973, in fact. But it does impact our world as far as applicators. And so why is that? Well, the Endangered Species Act essentially requires any government agencies to ensure any actions that they take will not jeopardize any species that have been federally listed as endangered or threatened, or their designated critical habitats, okay? So this is where the rubber hits the road for us, okay? So why are we hearing about this now since this has been around since 1973? Well, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, of course, is the government agency, as we all know, that regulates pesticide labels and deals with registration of pesticides. Okay, so they fall into that category that the Endangered Species Act is talking about. And so they had some challenges over the year, kind of keeping up with looking at registration of products with regard to the ESA and protecting endangered species. Okay. And so a number of environmental groups felt that EPA was not doing its job in terms of being in compliance with the Endangered Species Act and adequately preventing or minimizing exposure of endangered species to those pesticides. Okay. So they sued the EPA. Okay. It went to court, which is now becoming a much more frequent occurrence in how these things kind of shake out. And in 2023, the mega lawsuit was settled against EPA and in favor of the environmental groups. And so that required in that court order EPA to do a number of things in short order to start bringing themselves back in line with being in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And here you can just see a few of the quotes from the settlement of that lawsuit from various environmental groups and how they felt about that court ruling. So that's why we're hearing about it now. So I often get asked this question right from the get-go. Well, what are we protecting in North Dakota? Why are we having to deal with this in North Dakota? So I just wanted to take a quick minute to go through the current list of endangered species. Now, remember, this list is dynamic. It changes. Species change status between endangered and threatened, or sometimes their populations recover and they come off the list altogether. But right now, we're looking at the black-footed ferret, the Dakota skipper, which is a butterfly, the gray wolf, the northern long-eared bat, the pallid sturgeon, for those of you who are fishermen, the piping plover, the Porschike skipperling, and I never know how to pronounce that. That's also a butterfly species. The red knot, which is a wading bird, the rusty patch bumblebee, which you can see pictured on the bottom right here, the western prairie fringed orchid, and the whooping crane. And then, of course, there are other species that come onto the list if they're considered to be endangered or threatened. And so here in green, I've put the monarch butterfly. That is one that's under consideration currently right now for getting added to the list. And that would affect huge swaths of North Dakota because that butterfly migrates up here and then breeds up here as well. So that's one that we have to keep an eye on if that comes into the list. So those are essentially the species that we're looking at for right now in North Dakota. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the agencies that are involved with the Endangered Species Act. It's not just EPA, okay, although obviously they're one of the prime movers in this. So we have EPA, of course, as I said, because they regulate pesticides and approve labels, but they also have to consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, okay? And this is where, if you like, the kind of biological part comes about species and assessing what the potential risks are of exposure and the differences between certain chemicals in certain geographic areas or environments. Okay, so EPA will consult with those two agencies. If you ever read any of the documents or the strategies that we'll talk about in a second from EPA, you'll often hear U.S. Fish and Wildlife or NOAA Fisheries referred to in those documents as the services. So that's who they mean when they're talking about the services, just so you know. And then on the right-hand side, we also have USDA because USDA, as it relates to agriculture, assess and analyze the impacts of any of these mitigations that are being determined, what their impact will be on agricultural practices throughout the U.S. So they're all involved to some level in determining these strategies. So, of course, we want to know how this implicates applicators, right? That's what you're all here for, okay? So, as Joe said, and we're seeing right now on the new Dicamba labels, we're talking about things that are language that's being added to labels, okay, that may be a change from what we've seen before. And really, these fall into three categories, and they're to do with mitigating spray drift, runoff and erosion, or impacts to specific geographic areas where listed species or their critical habitat are found. And these are referred to as pesticide use limitation or usage limitation areas or poolers. You'll see that acronym used again in any of those documents. Okay, so that's what the label changes are directed at addressing when you see those on labels. So what about a timeline? Well, obviously, we've had two labels now in North Dakota. We had Liberty Ultra last year, and now we've got our new Dicamba labels that we're talking about today. Okay. EPA, as part of this whole process, set up what they called the strategies, which were going to outline the measures, the mitigations that they were going to take for each of the conventional pesticide groups as we think about them. So we had the herbicide strategy in 2024, which is obviously what we're focusing on today. We had insecticide strategy in 2025, also rodenticides, and then fungicides should be coming online at some point this year. And if you're interested in those, you can go online and read those on EPA's website. Okay. They always, as EPA always does, there's a notice and comment period when changes are happening to those strategies. So again, you can look out for those on the EPA website. So talking about the herbicide strategy, okay, so this is looking at mitigations that are going to be applied or come into play when you're thinking about and applying a herbicide. So there's a couple of key things to note when you're looking at these and you're looking at your product selection for the season, okay? So in terms of mitigations for herbicides, you have to consider them on a field by field basis, not an entire farm, okay? And that basically it goes into a whole bunch of factors that are used to determine risk, essentially, with exposure. Okay. You will have to meet anywhere from 0 to 9 mitigation points. And again, we'll show you, and Joe's going to talk about some of that on the Dicamba label. So depending on the product, depending on the situation, depending where you're applying, the label may ask you to meet, for example, 3 mitigation points in order to be able to apply that particular herbicide. Okay. And there's different ways to get to those required number of points depending on either geographic location or practices that are being applied on that particular field. Okay. The other thing to bear in mind is that if we're talking about spray buffers and runoff and erosion mitigations, they're going to be different depending on what herbicide it is and what crop combination that you have. So again, just going back to that level of detail about thinking what's going into what field, it is really key to do ahead of time. One of the key shifts in all of this kind of coming about that we have to remember is that now we're going to be asked to look beyond the printed label that we're used to seeing on our product jugs for these mitigations. Okay, so initially you may see a direction appear on the product label to go to one of or both of 2 EPA websites, which I've listed here. Okay, so there's 2 EPA websites that deal with these mitigations and the pesticide use limitation areas. So the first is Bulletins Live 2. Okay. And at the end, I have some QR codes so you guys can use those to get there, but it's easy to find if you just Google EPA Bulletins Live 2. And the second EPA website is the mitigation menu website. And this deals with listing mitigations, their definitions, and then assigning those point scores to those mitigations. Okay, so there's kind of, like they say, a menu of things for you to select from depending on what practices are being applied to the area that you're applying in. Now, even though you're being directed to a website, it's still considered part of the label and it's still legally binding. Okay, so that represents a shift from what we used to, like I said, in just reading everything straight off our product labels on the jug. So just bear that in mind because this is going to become the norm from here on out. So really quick, I just wanted to walk through a couple of these things just to give you a little bit of an overview of how they work. So here we're looking at a pesticide runoff vulnerability map by county, okay? The high vulnerability levels, i.e. where runoff is more likely to occur, is indicated in the dark green. The very low risk areas are in the dark tan color, and then low and medium are in pale green and sort of that pale creamy color. So if we focus on the top of the map and look at North Dakota, that you can see that most of all our counties fall in either the low or the medium category. So they score between 2 or 3 mitigation points just for runoff, depending which county you're in. And again, you can look at the list by county on the mitigation menu website. And that's important when we return back to the Dicamba labels, because you'll have to meet some of these mitigation points depending on the area you're in. So just know that by dint of which county you're in, you could get 2 or 3 mitigation points for runoff vulnerability. Okay, so just wanted to highlight that. And again, that's all on the mitigation menu website. Okay, we'll switch back to Joe.
Yeah, so I'm just going to take one slide here to kind of walk through some of these examples. and again, this is that same website that Madeleine just gave us on a previous slide. And this is just a very small snapshot of all the different things we can do to add up to our points. But basically, every time we apply dicamba this year, we need to make sure the field that we're applying it to has at least 3 points. A couple minutes from now, we will talk about some of those areas that will need to have more points than 3. But when we look what the EPA has prepared, and their goal is to really make sure that this list can be consistent throughout the years. So if I start almost on top of the screen there, on the top right, where it says no-till including perennial crops, obviously we're not going to apply these soybean dicamba labels in a perennial crop situation. But as Madeleine indicated, basically over the next 15 years, all herbicides will have this language on the label. So if you get into a perennial crop situation, then that's going to be 3 points for a label down the road that might need 3 points. Otherwise, I look at things like at the very bottom right side where it talks about cover crop use. The very bottom right, if it says you are a cover crop or continuous ground cover or a no-tillage long-term cover crop, that's 3 points right there. So if you're a long-term no-till user with cover crops, that basically gets you your 3 points you need. You'll see kind of in between other stuff that's not going to apply to really anyone in this state. I don't think I've seen any terrace farming yet driving across the state. But this is, again, kind of a national effort and a national pick list to make sure you get to 3 points or however many points the product you are applying will have. There are other things like if you work with in a soil conservation district or if you work with a certified agronomic advisor, things like that can get you 1 point as well. So it is a very thorough list. And as I mentioned, this is a very small snapshot of things that could get up to your points as you add them up to make sure you have sufficient points to meet the product label you're going to apply.
Okay. Yeah, and even things like if you keep your records, which you're required to keep your application records, that gets you 1 point right there. So a lot of it is kind of formalizing a lot of what you already do, is one of the key points I think here. Okay, so let's talk about spray drift real briefly. So this is obviously going to involve things like buffers, and these are to protect unmanaged areas. Okay, now there are different areas that you can include outside of the treated area that can be part of the spray drift buffer. Okay, and again, list these in detail on the mitigation menu website, but things like agricultural fields, roads, CRP land, mowed areas. So they try and give you as many options as possible for what you can include in those buffers. Okay, now at last count, and again, this is dynamic and changing, there are about 15 different ways, depending on, again, what practices and things you're doing in that particular field, that you could reduce the size of that buffer distance that's required there, okay? Now, there are some types of applications that don't need buffers, so that would be things like spot treatments, tree injections, and chemigation. So again, all situational, and it depends exactly what you're doing on your operation, but there are ways to kind of cut down those buffer distances, okay? And so I know this is a little bit of a busy slide, but I just kind of wanted to give you a visual on how you might look at this. And we have two different situations between the top scenario and the bottom scenario. In both cases, we're trying to get to meet a 50-foot buffer requirement. Okay. So that's the requirement that it's asking us to meet, say, for example, on the label. Okay. Now, the difference between the two here, and you kind of have to think about this a little bit, but in the top one, the downwind ecological spray drift buffer includes a portion of the cropped area because the adjacent managed areas are less than the identified spray drift buffer distance. Okay. Versus in the bottom example, the adjacent managed areas are equal to the identified spray drift buffer distance. Okay. So you can see in the top example, we've actually included in this case a portion of the cropped area. So we've got 20 feet of infield buffer there, okay, because we've missed the last couple of rows there. We've got 10 foot of CRP, and then we've got 20 foot of windbreak, okay? And those are a brilliant at math. At the first thing in the morning, we'll see that gets us to our 50, okay? Now, in the other scenario in the bottom, it looks a little bit different, okay, because we don't include any of that cropped area, but we do have the 20 foot of CRP and 30 foot of windbreak, which again gets us to our 50-foot buffer requirement. So again, this is going to take a little bit of thinking and looking at your situation, looking at what you're going to apply. If you need to have buffers in there, what can you and can't you include so that you can meet whatever the distance buffer required distance is on that particular label, on that mitigation. All right, Joe.
So what about dicamba? So the labels this year, we have a 240-foot downwind buffer. So Madeleine just gave an example of 50 foot. For these products, they are 240. The exact footage will probably vary by herbicide label as labels get these mitigation measures added to them. In general, some products like dicamba are more active at lower dose rates or kind of the off-target movement rates. So this is why this one's going to have a little bit longer buffer than some other products might have. And I really should also start with that top bullet point. If you have adjacent sensitive plants downwind, that is a no application day. So you do kind of have to know what's around the fields you have to know if you can even make that application. So again, adjacent sensitive plants downwind, no application to be made. If that is not the case, then you have to figure out what your spray buffer is. And it starts at 240 foot downwind from that last treated row. Madeleine covered some of these things that can be used. So if you've got 240 foot paved or gravel surface on the edge of that field, then that can be part of that buffer so you can spray up to your last row. If you don't, then you have to start figuring out how much of your field would need to be taken out from that application. There's just a couple of the examples on the labels. Section 9.2 basically gives all the different examples of what can be included within that buffer. And again, it's kind of the same website for the EPA that Madeleine has given us earlier. But here's a table directly lifted from one of these labels to show what this kind of looks like in practice. It is very important to note on the asterisks on the right side is these can be additive in nature. So for instance, on the top part of the slide there, it says a small field size. If you are only treating 1/10 of an acre to 1 acre with one of these dicamba products, that can reduce your buffer distance by 75%. Then if you have a basic windbreak in the middle part of the slide there, then that's 50% buffer reduction distance. So that gets you up to and over 100% in that example, but they are additive. In that case, you could spray up to the last row if you have those things in place. Now, these are kind of a simplified version of these things for this chart. You know, what constitutes a basic windbreak versus an advanced one. There are more details in that website on top of the slide there. I'd say most of the windbreaks and shelter belts we have are probably going to fall under the basic windbreak as we look at the landscape across the state. And there are things like hooded sprayers if you're using drop nozzles that can add into this. But again, just keep in mind that these are additive in nature, and this is just part of that table. There are more things we can do to add reductions in buffer distance.
Okay, so we'll turn now to runoff and erosion a little bit. And again, just an overview. So again, you're dealing with point systems, and this is to protect listed species and critical habitat up to 1,000 feet down slope. Okay. Again, because that's what EPA have kind of determined is critical for preventing kind of off-target movement in general. Okay, so again, you've got the same situation in terms of what you can include or is included in those areas. So the roads, the gravel surfaces, the field buffers. Here, there's approximately 40 ways, again, that you can reduce runoff and erosion mitigations, again, depending what your practices are. And again, it's a similar situation in terms of those same types of applications that don't need buffers. So the spot treatments, the tree injections, chemigation. In addition, though, here we have if you've got permanent berms in the field or tailwater return systems. Okay, so there's a few additional pieces there in terms of looking at runoff and erosion. And again, more detail on the mitigation menu website on those. Okay, so then I wanted to touch on these pesticide use limitation areas. So if you remember back up the top, we talked about specific geographic areas that were either important because of distribution of endangered or threatened species or because they contain designated critical habitat. So that's what we're dealing with here. So these are on Bulletins Live too, okay? And so your product label may direct you to go to Bulletins Live 2 to determine if your application site falls within a pesticide use limitation area, okay? Now you can, at present, check Bulletins Live 2 up to 6 months ahead of your application. Okay, so you have a good window to be able to check that as you're planning for the season ahead. And I would highly encourage you to do that so that you can make sure that you can comply with all these new directions that are coming your way. And so the Bulletins Live 2 hosts digital copies of the Endangered Species Protection Bulletins, and these may list additional mitigations beyond what's on your printed label. And again, as I said earlier, if there are additional restrictions, you must follow those, even though they're not necessarily directly on your printed label. Okay. Now, one thing I want to note here is you can print, and we'll take a look in a second at an example so you can see what they look like. But you can print these endangered species protection bulletins and add them to your pesticide record. And this is really critical for showing whether at the time you access Bulletins Live 2, your application site fell within or outside of a pesticide use limitation area. And so for right now, that seems to be the easiest way to document that is just print that off and keep it with the rest of your pesticide records. Okay, so what does Bulletins Live 2 look like? So I just took a couple of screenshots here to kind of show you this. So when you go to Bulletins Live 2, this is what you'll kind of be presented with. You'll have the blue box on the left where you're asked to input some information, and you'll have an interactive map on the right-hand side. So you're going to be asked in that blue box to put in obviously your location of your application site. And you can, I believe, put this in a couple of different ways. There was talk about how to do this using GPS data, using legal descriptions of land. And so there's a couple of different ways you can input that information there. You have to put the application month, and then you have to put the product, enter the product that you're talking about for this particular application. The easiest way to do that is to get the EPA registration number off the label if you have it, but you can enter it in differently too. But EPA numbers is always the way to ensure that you're getting the correct information. Okay, so you enter that in the blue box, and then you hit go. So this is just an example that I think I did last year where I looked at Cavalier, North Dakota, and I said I was going to apply in June of 2025, and I was going to apply Liberty Ultra. Okay. And so when I did that, you could see there's North Dakota. You could see the little black dot that represents my location. And there was nothing else on the map. Okay. So that means there was no pesticide use limitation areas at the time that I accessed that. Okay. But what does it look like if you have a pesticide use limitation area? So same map, same information, but I just it allows you to look for other use restriction areas within the US. And so I did that. And at the time I accessed it, there was one just to the east of Nashville there. So you can see that pinky red area denoted on the map just east of Nashville. Okay, that denotes a pesticide use limitation area. This map is interactive. You can zoom in on it. You can change to a satellite view if you're kind of looking for landmarks and that type of thing. And you can really hone in to see, especially if you're on the edge of that limitation area, whether you're in or outside of that use limitation area. And then you'll see on the top right, there's a link to printable bulletins. So either you can click within that pink area directly on the map, or you can click that printable bulletin, and it will take you to the Endangered Species Protection Bulletin associated with that restriction. So this is what these digital bulletins look like. So again, you can see you've got a close-up of that interactive map area as it relates to the pesticide use limitation area. And then you can see on the right-hand side, you have these summary tables and codes and limitation tables. And so this is where you're going to see potentially other restrictions and exactly what they are. So in this particular instance, if we look at the codes and limitation table, it simply said do not apply within the use limitation area between September 15th and May 15th. Now, that's a fairly straightforward one. They could be a lot more involved than that. They could be talking about buffers. There could be a whole lot of things. They might refer you to the mitigation menu website as well. So just read through those really carefully. This is what you're going to print out and keep with your pesticide record, okay? So that's what those look like. Okay.
So bringing it back to the dicamba labels. And I should say, it is a slow website. So you make sure you have patience when you log in to kind of look this information up. But so what I typed in is I said, I took the EPA registration number from one of these products and typed it into the search box. And here's just as bottom left, there is a zoomed out map of North Dakota with a little bit of Minnesota there on the eastern side. So I already mentioned that for basically every application, we need to have at least 3 points. If you're inside of Pula, this is 6 points. Now, a couple years ago when we were playing around with Bulletins Live 2, at that point, we were getting county level prohibitions. So now they do have areas more dialed in than that. So Madeleine, if you want to advance to the blown up map I have. So if it was a couple years ago, we would have had basically a strict prohibition on Richland and Ransom counties. Now what we've done is we've zoomed in to the one kind of Pula area we have on the map for these dicamba products this year, and it's portions of Richland and Ransom counties. And so you can see kind of in the middle part of that slide, there are some wide swaths of just solid pink. We will not be making applications. Primarily the grasslands down there is going to be a portion of that. Now, if you get to the right side of the map, as we get closer to I-29, you can see that it's almost individual farmsteads or fields that are circled. So if you're farming in these areas, I guess the good news is it's not a strict prohibition, but you will have to zoom in to see if your field or portions of your field are going to be impacted by this. And if you really zoom in on the map, and I played around with this last night a little bit, if you look at the top part of there on Highway 46, some of those circles go north of there. So actually some of these areas kind of leak into Cass County. In the southwest part of the state, they kind of leak into Sargent County as well. So if you're kind of on the border of the counties, just make sure that any field application you're making does not fall within this Pula. But again, it's kind of showing what the map looks like for these products. This was June 2026. I did take a look at July, and it stayed the same. So again, these are things we can do now before we are planning those applications to make sure if we need 3 or 6 points within these areas. So this is volatility mitigation. I want to spend some time here. We will not see this on every herbicide label because not all herbicides are volatile. Dicamba is one of the most commonly used herbicides that is a volatile compound. And what we recognize with volatility is the hotter it is outside, the more likely that molecule is to volatilize. So this is section 11 on the dicamba labels. The top part of the screen there is that DRA and VRA I already mentioned earlier. So this is label language that's once again in section 11. It's actually scattered a couple times throughout these dicamba labels if you take the time to read them front to back. For volatility mitigation, this is where it can get a little bit more complicated. So now we do have to look at temperature forecasts. And it is very clear we have to use either NOAA or National Weather Service forecasts. So if it is a weather forecast not backed by the National Weather Service, it actually would not count as far as when we get to record keepings. So again, using these official agency websites or forecasts. Then we get a breakdown based on what this temperature forecast is. So if the forecast is to be less than 85 degrees, then we can make an application as long as we have those things covered, which is it's that half-pound rate with the appropriate DRA and VRA. If we go to the other side, the very bottom line of this slide is that 95-degree or greater forecast is no applications. So if we have one of these hot summers and we have several days of 95 degrees, there's going to be a lot of days we're not applying these dicamba products. The in-between gets a little bit interesting, where if the forecast is between 85 and less than 95, so we'll just say 85 to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, we still have to follow the above line, so it's a half-pound dicamba with the appropriate DRA and VRA, plus no more than 50% of acres managed by a grower within the county can be treated. And there are some additional label language within these labels that indicates if you're an applicator and wondering if it's the treated acres from an applicator, it is acres managed by a grower within a county. So if you are servicing several growers or farmers within a county at the same day, it can be a little bit tricky on record keeping. So this could take some record keeping issues or efforts on the front end of the season. Can we go to the next slide here? And just to make it a little bit extra trickier, we do need to kind of really focus in on the specifics of this. So it's not just the forecast temperature for the day of application, it's also the following day. So for instance, if it's June 10th and the temperature forecast is 80 degrees, then you would think that you'd be able to make an application. But if we have a warm front coming and the forecast for June 11th is 96 degrees, then we would not be able to make that application on June 10th. So this is a forecast high for the day of and the day following application. To kind of further complicate things, that middle bullet point, if we're in that in between, where we can only treat 50% of the counties or 50% of the acres managed by a grower within that county, the remaining 50% cannot be treated until at least the third day after that first treatment. So let's say we have June 10th, it's 85 degrees. June 11th is 85 degrees, but then June 12th is 95. Even though it's the third day after application, we would not be able to come back and make that because that forecast was above 95. So this could get pretty tricky if we do get into a pretty warm stretch of weather. But again, just kind of highlighting it's the day of and day after. And then if we're in that middle range, then figuring out how to go back and retreat the rest of those 50% is going to take additional forecasting within the rest of the week or days following that application. We can go to the next one here. So the other thing we need to mention, and this is again a time to circle back and remind everyone, this does not replace mandatory dicamba training to use these products, is there is a long list of record keeping requirements. It's over 20 points you have to make and record every time you make an application. So these are covered in the trainings provided by companies, and each company does have a template available on their website for all the mandatory records that you do need to keep. So long URL links there in the slide here, but again, if you go to their company websites, they'll have record keeping that's pretty easy to navigate and find.
Okay, so kind of a conclusion to this, you're going to have to, again, as I mentioned, look at this on a field by field basis, crop, product, all of those things are going to play into it. These changes are happening now, but it's going to take several years for all the labels to catch up to have this language if it's deemed necessary by EPA. It's a very new process. EPA are still working to refine certain areas based on their public comment periods and feedback from whether it's applicators, producers, commodity groups, and they are trying to do their best to refine things. So as Joe mentioned with the maps, you know, one of the initial concerns that people had were these kind of block outlawing of applying by county. And so they are trying, that's one of the things that they try and refine. And you can see that reflected on that pesticide use limitation area for those dicamba products. Okay, this will, though, be the norm from here on out. So the sooner you can take a look at this, familiarize yourself with it, the better it's going to serve you well going forward. When we think about the point systems for mitigations, you can already look at all of your fields ahead of time and say, okay, how many mitigation points can I score for each of these fields? Can I get them all up to a 9, which would be fabulous, but maybe that's not possible depending, again, where you are and what practices you're applying. But the closer you can get to 9, the less you're going to have to worry about it, depending on which product's being applied. Again, it's dynamic, so it's changing constantly. Okay, the labels are going to get updated, things are going to change, processes are going to change, the EPA websites are going to change as information changes. So again, just being really aware of that and making sure that you are checking when you're required to check those websites and those product websites, importantly, as well, ahead of making those applications. Okay. So again, familiarity is key here. The sooner you start looking at that, the more familiar you become, the easier it will be for you moving forward. Okay, so there's a number of resources out there to try and help you navigate some of those things. And I'm just going to rest on this slide for a minute so you can take a picture of it with your smartphone, and then you'll have all the QR codes there. EPA on the top left has an endangered species main page, which has a whole bunch of links to other resources and other information. So that's a good one to check out. They also on the top right have their endangered species educational resources toolbox. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but there you can find some tutorials. For example, when you're looking at entering information into Bulletins Live 2, for example, they have some tutorials there. The middle two on either side of Bulletins Live 2 and the EPA mitigation menu websites themselves. Weed Science Society of America on the bottom left has some really good handouts, definitions, and some presentations that you might find helpful as you're looking at this for the first time and trying to navigate that. They really break it down into some easy to understand ways that are helpful. The middle one, the Pesticide Environmental Stewardship website from the Center for Integrated Pest Management, again, has some good resources, a good website there that you can check out. And then the bottom right one is the Mitigation Strategy Tool from Crop Life America. So they, again, have some great short videos and things that really try and break things down and make things kind of easier to navigate for you. So grab a shot of that with your smartphone, and then you'll have those QR codes to those resources to help you out. And then I just wanted to put up some contact information here. So Joe and I have worked on kind of a 2-page publication to help you with navigating, calculating your mitigation points and the steps to kind of walk you through it. The QR code on the top right will take you to the NDSU pesticide.org webpage, and it's right there. You'll see that top part of it is pictured right up front on the landing page. You just click on that image and you'll go straight to that 2-pager to help you navigate that. If you have general questions about mitigation type things, absolutely please feel free to reach out to me. I know ahead of this webinar, some people had questions about who to reach out to for the regulatory side at Department of Ag. So I spoke with them. If you can direct those questions to Richard Weiss at Department of Ag, he will be happy to answer those for you. So that would be things like state cutoff dates, any nuances of record keeping. You can direct those to Richard. So I'll just hang there for a second. Again, if you want to grab a picture with your smartphone or reach out to us.
And so the last couple of resources I just wanted to highlight. So I've been on this podcast for about 5 years now, War Against Weeds. It's collaboration with some of my colleagues in other states. We cover a lot of different things regarding weed science. So if you like weeds, there's things there. But for today's purposes, if we're going to go to the next slide, we have had 5 different episodes regarding the Endangered Species Act, the herbicide strategy, and things related to that. So we do have several episodes on now. We've been going at this for 5 years, over 10 seasons now. But if you wanted to scroll back and look at some of the discussions along the way of where these are coming from, kind of a more in-depth discussion than what we covered today, those are the season and episode numbers to find specific episodes. Again, for more in depth, we've talked to folks from the EPA, state regulatory agencies, so kind of getting their feelings and gauging how this has all evolved over the past couple of years. And the last resource, I'll just end in with some contact info. So in the bottom right of the screen is a QR code to the weed guide. This is an updated online version of the weed guide. So the time we had to publish in the fall, we did not have dicamba labels, but we have updated reflecting some of these dicamba label language. So the QR code now will bring you to an updated version online that has these 3 products in there, use rates, and some of the more of the weed control use rate side of things and the more detailed stuff we covered today. But they are in there. So just know that the online version now is different than the physical copy you have in your hands, and that the primary change there is adding these dicamba labels. So that is the last slide that we had prepared. I know we are pretty close to the top of the hour, but I guess at this point we will ask to stop the recording and see if any questions have filtered in or have popped up here at the end. And all I'm seeing in the chat